On Sunday, November 3rd, 2024, we set the clocks back 1 hour to bring daylight savings time to a conclusion. We get back to standard time. But what the heck is even daylight savings time, and why do we do it? I read a really cool book about it called Seize the Daylight. If you're interested in the story, you should totally check it out. Here's a couple things you need to know. All the shenanigans began because Ben Franklin realized people were sleeping in too much in the morning and then having to stay awake later in the evening to get your normal routine amount of sleep. And it was costing people money. We pay for electricity now, but back then they had to pay for candles, wax and wick and stuff like that. Ben Franklin was like, hey guys, if we get up a little earlier and spend more time awake during the day and more time sleeping at night, we can save the equivalent of over $200 million in today's money. A lot of people were like, yo, that is solid, including a guy named William Willett. And it started a global thing where people were like, we need to make these time zone adjustments every year to take more advantage of the daylight. Problem was there wasn't like a centralized time zone type of thing, basically. Like you didn't have the Greenwich clock, no means of communicating what like the time was to everybody else. And so time was kept by the railroads. Imagine the cluster would be if every single state was in charge of keeping like their own time and not coordinating with anyone else. That's what it was like with the railroad. People who would travel across the country had to change their watch multiple times to match the different times of the different like railroad lines. So a second benefit came of this where it's like, we got to get away from this railway time thing and we actually need to standardize this. William Willett died, and with him died this idea until World War I came along and they were like, actually, you know what? We could save some money because wars are expensive. It did finally become law. It passed in Great Britain in about 1916. And many people were like, this is absolutely absurd, including the National Weather Service. And this is because the National Weather Service is out there doing God's work, trying to collect meteorological observations every hour on the hour across the United States. And now all of a sudden we're going to skip an hour and then we're going to duplicate an hour. This is horrific for data. Once this was passed, Great Britain noticed it actually did save money. Like the power used for lighting dropped about 20%. It saved them about 1% of their total coal usage by just moving an hour. In the USA, we were like, I don't know about this thing. And the propaganda machines were like, do it to win the war. And we finally came around to the idea right around 1918. And then farmers were also like, no, this is totally stupid. They were like, we don't care what the clock says. We can't do the things we need to do until the morning dew is gone. And so you may have us change our clocks. And it's like, but we go by what earth and nature tells us. During these times, kids rode milk trains to school. So if you wonder if anything has changed. And Governor Bartlett of New Hampshire was like, this is BS. Because now for half of the year, the trains were running an hour earlier than they did before. In the meantime, all these different time changes were handled by the states individually, and it was a cluster. Look at these dates that like daylight savings time started and began. They were all different. It wasn't until 1966 that this was federally regulated. Hawaii and Arizona were like, yeah, we're not going to do that, and they do not observe daylight savings time. So in the summertime, Arizona is the same time zone as California, and in the winter, it's the same as the mountain time zone in places like Colorado. Anyway, super fascinating read. There's even more details that are wild and super interesting to know. Seize the Daylight. I'm not being paid to tell you about it. It was just really fascinating and interesting to read.